And thank you everyone who's joined us today. Like Catherine said, today we want to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. This is one framework that many museum professionals around the world use to advance inclusion, to advance as well, and to prioritize historically excluded voices. In different parts of the world, people use different terminology as well. Sometimes we use terminology as human rights. We use terminology as ethics, transitional justice, or different other types of frameworks. This is one that it's very much North American, but we wanted to just put it there because sometimes it's easy to recognize. So what we are all doing here today, what all of these different professionals that we have here in our panel are doing is trying to advance the inclusion of historically excluded voices at different levels of museum institutions and museum practice. So this is what we want to do with this table, is to really present different practical cases and experiences of museum professionals that are working to advance inclusion in museum work, and also some of the challenges that they have faced institutionally, but also personally while doing this work. So with that, I want to start by introduce our first panelist, who is Patty Arteaga. Patty is the project lead for the Undocumented Immigrant Activism Collective Initiative at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. Patty is co-building a national collection on how undocumented youth created their own movements and built a political influence in the United States. This collection centers community input and careful navigation of museums in collecting material culture and oral histories from marginalized folks. And Patty was born and raised in Los Angeles. She attended UCLA for her Bachelor of Arts and George Washington University for her Master of Arts in Teaching. Throughout the Smithsonian Institution, she has held several positions on project management, curatorial, and education. So welcome, Patty.
Hi, thank you for that lovely introduction, and I'm so happy to be with these wonderful panelists. So as Armando mentioned, my name is Patty Arteaga, and I have this project that I'm currently undergoing, but I actually want to talk about something different in that I've been not specifically centered on my project, but just ponderings and observations I've been kind of seeing within the last few months, kind of at the beginning of COVID and now with the recent unrest. And I think that, well, I'll just get into it about the question and the through line that I always see with ethical practices is always a position of power, right? Who has it? How are we valuing it? How are we sharing it? How, even the sharing of it is kind of a containment of power. So how is it being co-shared and how are we benefiting from that? So that's kind of my stance on how I see ethical practices, right? And power can be a good thing, not always a bad thing, but it's always just, right, how does it exist in the acknowledgement of that? And so how does it fit into kind of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility? Armando mentioned that's kind of a North American framework. I've seen the United States, I've seen it more as an idea, the acronym, right? The acronym can change, but that also plays into, right, the framework of centering voices that have long not have the power to be the focus or the main focus, centering stories, centering history, centering people. And now this framework is centering that. And what I've been seeing lately is that urgency to bring about this work and this framework forward within the past few months. And my quandaries and questions are the urgency and the rush to do this work now that has been in existence for quite some time, but why did it take a worldly pandemic for this to be kind of be deemed a priority? Why now? And how all of these sudden resources and staff time is now available when it was available before? So that's just where I'm coming from and where I'm seeing, and it's just why now, why the urgency, and how is this urgency going to actually make any change when this has been part of, I guess, museum work for a long time? And that for me is also, the urgency can also lay in that so many folks have been laid off And so now there's a minuscule amount of people to do this work and carry against these institutions forward. But also, is it a receipt for these statements made about working with communities and working to center those stories now, or that it has been before? So to me, am I seeing this as a receipt for accountability? Are we capitalizing on it? Suddenly, this is the hot, trendy work, and now suddenly this wants to be a priority. So how are we making sure that this is, yes, the priority right now, but how are we doing diligently? Why is this work relevant to our audiences now? Wasn't it, beforehand? How are they being held accountable, this work? And once this kind of pandemic and social unrest, at least in the United States, quiets down, is this work still going to be important? Once the stories of how COVID is disproportionately affecting, at least in the United States, Black, Brown, and Indigenous bodies, is this still going to be an important thing to move forward? And one last thing about this framework is who is leading it, right? The theory and the questions can all be there, but who is leading it is also an important question that we need to think about in terms of where does the power resonate. And so that to me is where my ponderings and questions of how these ethical practices are being carried, right? And also just bringing it back to, we are also holders, the people who are carrying this work forward and want to see it succeed, we're also holders of this power. And just because, some of us can ascribe to these marginalized histories and backgrounds and stories does not absolve us from, the wrongdoings that we're doing to other communities. And so it's just like a moment in time for reflection. And I think this is kind of for not only just the field, but I guess I'm going to generalize the whole world in general. But just, all of these questions come with a love of the work that I do, with a love of museums, but also just the acknowledgement that we just got to do better, because whatever we were doing before has never been enough, has never, cannot be enough anymore, because the world is melting, like in every sense of the word. And so with this urgency to do, IDA or idea work, let's go forward with it, because this is what we've been wanting to, right? We've been wanting to have it to be a priority, to be on this national platform. But in the rush to do it and to improve it, I want to throw out just to always have the pause and the reflection, to always see where the power is laying at. And that's where I'm going to leave it at, because I think everyone else has just beautiful, the panelists here are incredible speakers that probably can speak more to specific cases, but I just really wanted it to throw it out there, because it's just been really in the back of my mind, or actually the front of my mind for the past few months. So thank you.
Thank you, Patty. And I think you really bring out some of those questions that I think a lot of us have had, or probably all of us have had in our heads as well. And it's actually, yes, this sort of trying to prioritize this work, right, that many of us have been doing for many years, but now institutions want to capitalize on that. And it's, again, are we being consistent with the history of institutions, or are we just, using, again, Black, Indigenous, brown bodies to sort of, like you said, sort of cover, the lack of this work that hasn't been done in the past. And I really thank you for that presentation, because I think you really have raised a lot of those questions that we're going to continue to talk a bit. And now I want to introduce our second panelist, who is Craig Middleton, and he is a curator at the National Museum of Australia and a visiting fellow at the Australian National University in Canberra. At the National Museum of Australia, he is responsible for research, collection development, and on-site and online projects associated with the Centre for Defining Moments in Australian History. Until recently, he was manager of the Centre of Democracy in Adelaide, South Australia, And in 2017, Craig was awarded a George Alexander Foundation Fellowship to explore political histories and museum practice in American museums. Craig's curatorial practice and current research is centered around lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, and queer plus lives, and through the application of queer theory to museological practices, challenges heteronormative ways of knowing, doing, and being in museums. Welcome, Craig. And good morning.
Yes, good morning. It's just gone 6:15 in the morning here, so it's quite early for me. But I love being part of these things, so I'm happy to be here. I'm just going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint because I couldn't help myself. All right. See if this works. But yes, thank you. My name is Craig, and first, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal, Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, which is also known as Canberra, which is Australia's capital city. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders of these peoples and their elders are past, present and emerging. And that's really important for me to do as we learn, share and talk today. I'd also like to acknowledge my privilege today because I think it's important to the conversation. So I'm white, cisgendered, able-bodied. I have university degrees, middle class, and I speak English as a first language and only language. And so all of these things contribute to my privilege in this world. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. I'm also queer. I identify as having same-sex attraction, and I express my gender identity in what could be considered non-normative ways. But I think I'm now drawing on something that Patty just said, that actually despite my association with the marginalised community, I too can cause further marginalisation to the communities I'm working with, even the ones that I consider to be part of, because of the blind spots that I have generally and through the work that I do in museums. So I'm going to actually talk to you about a project that I did a few years ago back when I lived in Adelaide in South Australia. So I'm going to tell you first about the Forum Gallery. The Forum Gallery is part of the Migration Museum, which is a museum in South Australia, which is the city I used to live and work. And it was established in the early 1980s as an inclusive space in which community groups could tell their stories in their own words. And this was at the height of multiculturalism discourse and politics in Australia. So while these kinds of galleries are really common today, at the time it was quite a radical innovation, and for this museum specifically. And what it's become over the years is a home away from home for quite established ethnic communities in South Australia, most of which are made up of older people who migrated in the second half of the 20th century. And these groups make really important contributions to the museum and to the community more generally, of course. But a colleague, Dr. Nikki Sullivan, and I wanted to do something a little bit different than had been traditionally done in this space, and we approached a queer youth drop-in, and this was in part motivated by a concern we had that despite the principles of inclusion and diversity on which this gallery had been set up, the space was typically dominated by these established groups, and more marginalised groups were not being represented at all. And one of the reasons the Forum Gallery had been dominated by these groups wasn't because other groups had approached the museum and they'd been refused exhibition for whatever reason, but it's more because these more marginalised groups were either completely unaware that the museum existed or this gallery existed, or that they didn't feel that the Migration Museum was a space with which they identified. So this sort of led to us acknowledging that this kind of open door approach to community access and diversity work is in fact not equitable, since it fails to consider the ways in which structures of power and privilege operate to include and exclude, such that some groups, and in this case it's those post-World War II migrant groups, are much more likely to access spaces like this than other marginalised communities. For example, groups whose identity focus less on ethnicity, more on sexuality, disability, and other forms of exclusion, including homelessness, incarceration, domestic abuse, and so on. So we wanted to disrupt this tendency. And now these are just some photos of the exhibition that ended up going in there. But what we did is we approached a community leader who was integral in the establishment, funding and running of this Feast Queer Youth Drop-In, which is a space in Adelaide for 15 to 25-year-old queer identified people to connect socially and safely. And after a few initial meetings, we decided that this leader would co-facilitate the project with one of the long-term attendees of the drop-in. They would raise funds to cover production costs, work with the young people to collect objects and stories for display, and write the panel content. So all fired up, we went to visit this drop-in, Nikki and I, to share this amazing opportunity. And of course, looking back now, they looked at us like we were aliens from another planet. They were so not enthusiastic. They were like, what are you doing here? And so we left feeling quite defeated, actually. So over the next few weeks, we took time and we thought really deeply about what had happened. We read a lot of literature, and we talked to as many people as we could to try work out what had happened. And what we soon came to realize is that despite our best intentions, we had imposed a vision that was ours on a group of young, disenfranchised people whom we had no previous relationship with and who had no reason to trust us. So we had assumed that we were giving them something, an opportunity to have their voices heard, when in fact we were asking them to give us something. And we did it without consulting them, talking to them about what mattered to them, if they even wanted to have their voices heard. And so in short, our assumptions blinded us to the structural inequalities that underpinned our relationship with this group of people. And what we ended up doing was inadvertently reproducing the process of exclusion that we had set out to counter with this project. So we changed our approach. We began attending the drop-in meetings with a kind invitation from the group regularly. We engaged artists and other people to run workshops irrespective of the young people's participation in the exhibition. And we took much more of a backseat approach than we initially imagined we would. And every time we went to the drop-in, we took a badge maker and some LGBTIQ focused badge designs and some blank templates. And it was badge making that proved a really great way to connect with the young people, to have conversations and get insights into their world, which blew me away. And these social interactions were far more meaningful to the young people than our initial transactional approach. So as we got to know the young people better and to learn about what mattered to them, we became increasingly uncomfortable with the content that was being designed by the two co-facilitators of the project. And at the same time, we were having really challenging conversations with them. The drop-in attendees had coincidentally done a workshop with a narrative therapist and who were capturing their stories. And so to cut a long story short, these stories became the centerpiece of the exhibition. This is just one of them, if you have time to read that while I'm talking. These became the centerpiece of the exhibition. We got rid of all the usual things that you might do for an exhibition, that themes and objects that are associated with particular themes. You know, we just chucked it all out the window because that's not what this group wanted. And the stories were amazing, and the young people's generosity in sharing them far outstripped anything we had imagined when we first conceived the idea to work with this group. And so what this taught us is that whilst letting go of the reins, relinquishing authority, and being willing to moderate one's own practice can be risky or can seem risky, it can actually pay enormous dividends. And so in the end, we did have a great exhibition. We had this end result that the young people were really proud of and they felt ownership of. And just a gallery full of really moving stories and objects, unexpected objects. At the same time, working with the young people from the drop-in provided us amazing opportunities to critically reflect on these structures of power and privilege that underpin and inform all of our relationships with our collaborators, our approach to community engagement generally, and the ways in which our work can challenge and sometimes unintentionally contribute to social injustice. So I suppose I wanted to end by saying that, you know, even with the best intentions, and even though I can, you know, fly a flag that I'm part of the LGBT community, that actually I am still blind, and we are still blind to the structures of power and privilege that operate in this world, and particularly within the museum space and within an institutional space. And so for me, it's important to adopt a critically reflective practice, to keep asking why we are doing particular things, why we make particular decisions unthinkingly, and acknowledging power and privilege where it exists as much as possible. And this type of critical reflective practice is also an ethical practice, in my opinion, that recognises the relational nature between one's own world, their professional context, their personal and professional identities, their actions, and their position relative to others. So I'll stop there, but thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Wonderful presentation. And, you know, really, I think your presentation again shows us that this is a growing process. It is a learning process for all of us who engage in this type of work. I think it also picks up on something that Patty said, that this is work that cannot be rushed, right? Like, it's slow work. And I think you also, your presentation really highlighted that. So thank you for that. Now I would like to welcome our next speaker, who's Thiané Diop. Thiané is a graduate student in cultural studies at the University of Winnipeg in Canada. She works as a research assistant for the Museum Queries research group, which prioritizes LGBTQ2+ contributions and interventions into museums and museum studies. She has developed a strong interest in the power of representation of individuals who are marginalized in museums. Thiané also analyzes the representation of queer Black bodies in these institutions. Thiané's research is shaped by her academic background and the histories of colonized peoples and the mechanism of neocolonialism, as well as her over 10 years of experience working in national historic sites and national museums in Canada. Welcome, Thiané.
Hi, thank you. So yeah, first I just want to thank everyone who's tuning in today for taking the time to listen to us and what we have to say, and also say that I'm very honored to be speaking alongside such fantastic panelists today. Yeah, I guess one of the places for me to start is to talk about what I have been up recently, what I've been up to recently. It's been quite a busy summer on my end. At the beginning of June, if we're talking about kind of what Patty was touching upon earlier, kind of the social upheaval that was going on, one of the things that happened here in Winnipeg was that there was a large rally that was organized by a group called Justice for Black Lives, both in solidarity with the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, which is actually one of the closest cities to Winnipeg, the city where I'm in, but also to talk about police violence against specifically Black and Indigenous bodies right here in Winnipeg. And for our city this year and recently has been one of great loss. And that rally and that march started at the legislative building here in Manitoba, and then walked down to the institution where I formerly worked, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. And for me, that was kind of a moment that brought up a lot for me, because being a former employee of that institution, I was very much impacted by the way in which diversity, inclusion, equity, and accessibility works and does not work, the way in which it is recognized and the way that it is not recognized. And so that day for me was a pretty emotional day, to be standing outside that institution with a crowd of people who were expressing a desire to value and to protect Black life and Black experiences, and that's kind of not the experience that I had being an employee at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights for over 4 years. And so from there, I put my experiences, or some of my experiences at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, on a page that a friend of mine started called It Happens in Winnipeg. And she started this page because we were having conversations about how a lot of times we think that anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism is something that has like geographical borders and that it happens over there and somewhere else. And with what has been going on recently and in general in Canada, the conversation is very much that it happens south of the border and that it is not part of our realities here, when it very much is. And so the page was created for people to share their personal experiences. And one of the things that the founder, Nampande Lande, put out was asking us to be brave and to put our names on our experiences and to kind of talk about the power of owning our own stories and our own experiences. And so that's exactly what I did, is I put my name out there and I said that, yeah, I had experienced and witnessed quite a bit of anti-Black racism when working for the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, and that my efforts to address it, which had been a part of kind of how I operated my entire time that I was employed at the museum, were not acknowledged and did not bring about any type of meaningful change. And that then spawned a response from the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, as we have seen from a lot of institutions. And I think this is the part where I transition to kind of how this impacts the sector as a whole, is that we're in a moment where we're having conversations about diversity, inclusion, equity, and it's kind of a moment where people feel like they need to say something and they need to take a position on things. And so the CMHR, like many other institutions, made a statement saying that they supported Black life and wanted to amplify and support marginalized voices. And after having the experiences that I had within that institution, that just kind of like created some rage in me, because that didn't really translate with how I had been treated and how I saw people around me being treated. And so if we're talking about ethics and kind of how we do our work, I think that honesty is a really, really big part of it. And for institutions to do better, I think that we have to acknowledge kind of where we are and where we have been. And as museums and working in the museum sector, a very big part of where we have been is that museums absolutely have played a role in creating and perpetuating systems like anti-Blackness, systems like racism, and that kind of this was a role that they played in their early days, and that sometimes they still do today in the way that the content is put together, in the way that policies are put together, in the way that we interact with communities, that this is not just something from the past that we have remedied, but that we actually have to intentionally and on purpose reckon with, look at, and address. And yeah, so I think that when it comes to doing better and wanting to do better on issues around diversity, inclusion, equity, and accessibility, the place where I know things about has to do with race and racism. And part of why I know about these things absolutely has to do with lived experience. I think, as some of the panelists before me said, when things impact you, when barriers impact you, you notice them. When systems are detrimental to you, you notice them. When barriers do not impact you and when systems actually benefit you, it is often more comfortable not to notice them and not to acknowledge them. And I think that that's kind of, if we're talking about ethics and we're talking about change and doing better, that's a place where we have to start and where we have to look at. But it doesn't just have to do with lived experience, it also has to do with knowledge and education. So as Armando said in my introduction, looking at the history of colonialism, the legacies of it, how neocolonialism operates, how anti-Blackness is still present today in our societies. These are things that I have studied and that I have read up on. And I highlight this specifically because I want to say that there is information out there, and that there for generations has been information out there about how these mechanisms operate, how they are still present in our society. So for me, the idea that right now it is a surprise that we're having conversations about kind of a global reckoning of what's going on around race and racism in the world doesn't really cut it for me. Like, this information has been out there and these conversations have been out there for a really long time. So like Patty, I'm a little hesitant at kind of what is the rush and why now, and what is the intention behind why now. But I'll finish off by talking about the combination of that lived experience and that intentional seeking out of information. Because if we are wanting to do better, I think that those are the two things that are very key. And so if we're talking about leadership, people in positions of power, people who are decision makers within the museum realm and the museum world, and as museum professionals ourselves, we have to ask ourselves, are the people who are making decisions around what policies we are using, how we are interacting with communities, what content we are putting out there, how we are presenting different stories, and even the conversations of kind of what are our ethical expectations of ourselves and each other. Do these people have the experience and the knowledge necessary to do so? I think it's a really important place to start too. And a lot of these conversations around diversity, inclusion, accessibility, and equity can sometimes end up in a place where we are looking for people who can check a box for us and fit a certain look or a framework that we're trying to say, like, we have included these historically marginalized voices because, look, we've got one of them and we've got one of these too. But just kind of being able to check the boxes and have the faces kind of absolve us from looking at these questions further won't make the change and won't bring about kind of the expectation of like integrity, professionalism, and excellence that we should have in our profession. I think that it needs to be a personal responsibility for each and every one of us to seek out the knowledge and information that we need to be able to do better, and to also recognize when we don't have what it takes, and in those moments to look for more information, or sometimes even just step aside and make room for others who do have that information and that knowledge to weigh in these conversations, to make some decisions, to share in that power, and to help us to move forward. I think that's all for me for today.
Thank you, Thiané. Really great presentation, and I want to thank you again because I know it is really hard speaking from lived experience. I think you also brought up something that's really important, and it's that track record, which also Patty was talking about, and I think we've seen it, you know, in our part of the world. Museums putting out all these public statements, like you said, and then, of course, not having the track record to back them up, and then people reacting to them. I mean, here in Canada, we've seen 6 major museums being called out because of that. In the US, I think I've tracked so far 16, and now 1 in Australia as well that has been called out. I think this is, again, right, like, you know, people, you know, putting out statements that are empty, that are disingenuous, and then being called out. I mean, institutions, not people putting out the statements, right? And I think that is a big ethical dilemma that that we're looking at, and I'm really, really like thankful for you to bring it up and to speak. And with that, I would like to introduce our next panelist, who is Megan Sue-Chue-Lam. Megan is currently a Master of Museum Studies candidate at the University of Toronto, Canada. She's also the co-founder of Museum Professionals of Color at the U of T. She is she's trained as an educator and has worked in public programming and education at several cultural institutions in Toronto, Canada. And welcome, Megan.
Hi, thank you, Armando and IC Ethics for having me. As Armando said, my name is Megan Sue-Chue-Lam, and I'm a Master of Museum Studies candidate at U of T, University of Toronto, which is on the ancestral lands of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca and the Mississaugas of the Credit River on Turtle Island. I'm a Chinese-Canadian settler, and I'm very grateful to be able to work and live here as an uninvited guest, while acknowledging that the ongoing occupation of this land is an integral part of the Canadian colonial project. So to continue off of Thiané's discussion on education and to really echo a lot of what she just said, I'm here as a representative of Museum Professionals of Color, as Armando stated, or MPOC. And we're a student group that I co-founded alongside a group of my amazing peers. And the initial reason why I reached out to them is I was feeling extremely isolated as a racialized person in my program, and being aware that I'm a visible minority in a predominantly white space is nothing new, especially in academia. But I think the fact that museum discourse is currently so focused on decolonization, as it rightfully should be, just highlighted more than ever the fact that I was surrounded by white peers in these discussions being led by an all-white faculty. And it made me think, you know, I'm meant to be preparing for my career through this professional program, but it's lacking something fundamental to me, which is that I don't feel that I can be properly prepared for my career without hearing from the perspectives of people who know what it's like to navigate these largely white colonial museum spaces as a non-white person. So for reference, over 50% of Toronto's population identifies as a visible minority, but only around 15% of people in our program are people of color, which translates to about 10 out of 60 in our cohort. So it's very clear to see how these conditions are reproduced in museums. And the thing is that everyone can benefit from a more inclusive and accessible environment. And yet we students are still expected to take the work on ourselves of proving our oppression to those in charge in order to show that we deserve better. And even then we can be met with resistance. And there are some really incredible hardworking students from across our faculty, including our own MPOC executive member, Dominica, who took it upon themselves to do the work of creating an entire multifaceted campaign consisting of a petition, letter writing, and a survey in order to demand that the faculty address its shortcomings in regards to DEAI. And the results of the survey have made things very clear. So less than 4% of respondents felt that there are enough courses on BIPOC, LGBTQ2S+, and disabled experiences, and less than 1% of respondents felt that conversations on these topics are facilitated properly. But despite these low numbers, everyone is expected to enter the field not knowing how to engage properly with these topics and the diverse audiences that they should be connecting with. And it's not just that people aren't getting the most out of their education in these programs, although that does play a large part in why we want things to improve, but people are actually being harmed and traumatized because of the fact that diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility aren't being prioritized. And then again, we feel the need to relive the trauma by dredging up the ways that we've been harmed in order to prove to institutions that they need to change. So we are the ones who pay the price for the fact that museums are used to being reactive rather than proactive. And we hosted a panel in March, and one of our panelists, Wendy Ng, she's a great advocate for change in museums here in Toronto. And one of the things that she said emphatically to our largely white audience was, what are you willing to sacrifice? Because Black, Indigenous, and people of color are making sacrifices every day. So if you want to be an ally, you have to be willing to make sacrifice. And that's true. People really need to realize that the radical cultural change that people are demanding is not going to come from the same people who have been in charge this whole time. We need to hear from different perspectives. And so one of the things that has majorly helped us in this fight is solidarity. And museum studies is just one of 4 programs in our faculty. And what we found is that once we were able to communicate across the faculty instead of remaining siloed, we've been able to uplift each other so much in support of our mutual and individual goals. And furthermore, the emotional support that we all need so desperately is much stronger. And we're seeing this being echoed in the broader museum field, as well as people connect across institutions. So the work can feel very defeating at times, but it's been made a lot easier because it's not just me or another individual trying to prove our own personal worth. There's a lot of power in standing with a group such as this network of professionals as well, in order to show that the issue is systemic, or the multiple issues are systemic. So if we truly want to decolonize museums and enact reconciliation, as is being preached in museum studies, then we need our education to move beyond having discussions on what is being done in white museums, being led by white folks in spaces dominated by white people. An integral part of seeing the real change is removing barriers for more Black and Indigenous people to enter these programs as students as well as instructors. And the fact that a majority of the meager racial diversity in our program by a very wide margin is made up of Asians is not good enough. Because in order for change to be made successfully, we need more than just token diversity. And we need more than Black and Indigenous scholarships and modified job requirements. We need the people in charge to do the genuine and difficult work of examining themselves and the structures that they're a part of, as Thiané was saying, in order to make room so that a more inclusive culture can be fostered. So clearly there's a lot of room for growth in the field at large, but a major difference can be made if we address things closer to the root in our education. And obviously a lot of museum workers don't go through these museum studies programs, but if these programs are meant to be the forefront for educating people on the critical museum issues and preparing them to be museum professionals, then they really need to set an example for what a better museum model could look like. And of course, the education issue doesn't start or end with museum studies, and there's a lot that needs to be remedied in our grade school curricula to close that gap further. But these programs do constitute a major piece of the puzzle.
Thank you, Megan. I think you, again, brought up so many issues that are so important to all of us and that connect so nicely with so many of the other speakers. Particularly, I want to just highlight exactly what you're saying, and this issue of mainly white-dominated education, right? And how we're reproducing the same patterns, and that the people, also majority white in these museum study programs, are the ones who end up in leadership positions as well in these museums that now are being called out for having perpetrated all of these human rights violations, right? So I think it is really, this continuation of the education system and then going into the institutions. So I think there is a really very clear connection that that we can make from your presentation as well with Thiané, and thank you for that. And I think we'll have a little bit more time as well to chat and to ask questions in the panelists as well in a little bit. So I now want to introduce our last panelist, and this is Julián Zapata Rincón. Julián is an assistant curator at the Museum of Antioquia and lecturer at the Instituto Tecnológico Metropolitano in Medellín, Colombia. Transvestite and non-binary marica trans. Her interest in research topics concentrate on gender studies and non-normative hetero-homo identities. From this perspective, she has developed diverse archivist initiatives and actions in Colombia. As part of the Museum 360 program of the Museum of Antioquia, she has initiated and supported several processes that engage diverse communities and populations, such as La Esquina, The Corner, Vitrinas, Windows, and Residencies Cundinamarca. Julián holds a master's in visual arts from the Universidad Nacional de Colombia, Medellín campus. And welcome, Julián.
Hi, everyone. Please give me a second. I share my screen. Hi, I'm so excited here. How to work with people who have been historically oppressed and invisible. People are most erased from the history, colonial history, imposed and written by the winners. How to work with these people we have fought and resist without taking over their stories and experience. These are questions I wonder every time I have had the opportunity to work on those populations. I am a trans, no-binary fat, or marica trans no-binaria in Spanish is so pretty. We has had the opportunity to attend university and understood how many of the academic process have appropriated the stories of our trans sisters and trans brothers. So I try to find a space to listen to them. It is not so much to give them a voice. It has been saying some space, but really listen to their screams and their powerful voices that has always been there. I want to start by presenting to a project called La Consentida. It is a part of Museo 360, Museum 360 project of the Museo de Antioquia. I have been invited as a curator a couple of times for this project. The first time I had the opportunity to invite trans women from Medellin Center. Many of them are residents in this area, in the downtown Medellin and central Medellin. These trans women are part of Project En Plural. We joined a group of trans women to the exhibition La Consentida es la Procesión. This is an artwork of Deborah Arango. Every Monday, this space becomes a meeting point for them and their stories. Beyond the casual convergence, this exercise animated at the conversation between their lifestyles, the work by Deborah Arango, and the other artworks. In consequence, En Plural and the connection to La Consentida was proposed on the basis of a questioning around sexual orientations and gender identities, and also their different representation in contemporary artistic language. Trans women's groups made up of people with the Centro para la Diversidad Sexual y de Género, or Center for Sexual and Gender Diversity, has a close relation and others in prostitution or sexual work. Each session started at the CDSG. Is a meeting point left for the Museo de Antioquia and during the tour trans women who work in Barbacoa sector. This is an area where many of the trans women work in sexual work or prostitution in Medellin. And this collaborative project was an important way of confronting or getting this group of women closer to the experience they believe to be distant. Most had never visited the Museo de Antioquia or any museum. They always say it is a distant place where people like them were not received. With this process, the core feel that stories of contemporary art generate a conversation with them, with those people. We see the white queue as something that will not permit their lives. This is one of the moments to remember, and it invited us to think about how museums operate. It is the moment you enter the building. How can this space be a place that is invited anyone who likes to enter to the zoo? Some of the participants to go in because they were dressing close to short, close to working prostitution.
I think it froze. Should we give it a couple of seconds and wait. And I don't know if we can maybe stop sharing the screen. Okay, so hopefully Julián will be able to come back, but I think her presentation was very, very powerful. I've been very privileged to visit as well Julián's workplace in Medellin, and it is really one of the most inclusive museum practices that I've seen. And I think this is also related to the fact that we can see the power of one individual, in this case Julián, who has been fighting inside of a very conservative society, and having the courage to do that and to bring these issues inside of an institution, but also the courage of the institution to support Julián and the work that they've been doing, and including populations that museums aren't usually engaging with. And I think this is again related to a lot of the points that all of the panelists have made, especially in relation to the not rushing this type of work. And I know that the museum and Julián have been working for years and years developing these relationships, and Julián also being part of many of these communities as well, of course, makes a big difference. So with that, hopefully Julián will be able to reconnect. But I want to thank all of the panelists this evening, this morning, and this afternoon. And I want to also open the floor for questions from the audience as well. So questions are through the chat. So I'm not seeing any questions right now. But if not, I guess I will just ask a general question where the participants can type their questions. Oh, Julián is back. We can't hear you.
Sorry, my connection is so bad. Sorry. Please give me a second. Sorry. I hope you hear. Give me a second. Okay, here we go again. In the first meeting, they knew the artworks taking a tour of La Consentida. In this session, rather than developing a regular guide, the aim was to generate a horizontal conversation in which their voices were part of the conversation. They fully identified with the works. In special, they experienced tour by Jenny Megan. This Jenny Megan, who was reflected in the work by Eladio Vélez. This portrait is remembered. In the retrato de la señora Sofía Gaviria T, portrait of Mrs. Sofía Gaviria T, she saw a sad, rigid woman who has suffered too much, going almost in the opposite way to the reading of this work that portrays an upper-class woman in the series. Despite this reading, Jenny looks at herself and she dreams in the future, sitting in the same position, wearing just a stunning dress. An important part of this collaborative exercise between En Plural and La Consentida is having this meeting for learning with the premise that they could be applied to their daily activities, to their lives. For this reason, other people were invited to this conversation. They were taught, for example, some makeup tricks that they could apply. Finally, it is important to highlight a horizontal conversation and exchange of knowledge of reading and understanding each other. Nothing is achieved if the curatorships and readings or knowledge of the works are limited to a single type of audience. Through this experience, it's possible to know diverse reading of those peoples we have been historical invisible. And it is the opportunity to hear them tell the history from their lives. On the other hand, there is a way of getting closer, working and listening the essential voices of the city. It is Ladani. She is Ladani. She is a trans woman over 60 years. She has been doing street theater for around 40 years at traffic lights and city parks. She has been chased by institutions such as the police and the church. Precisely in these days of quarantine and COVID-19, she has been immensely affected, but not having the possibility of seeking economic incomes, and she has not received governmental support that have given so far. I want to share a brief video where she makes a reading of some artworks from the Museo de Antioquia. These readings are away. These readings are away from academic forms and represent her body and life experience.
I'm not sure if the video is working, Julián.
Sorry. Dani is maybe one of the clearest examples of resistance in Medellin. She is a very believing and religious woman devoted to her Catholic faith. At the same time, she critiques violence against gender and trans bodies and lives. She has risked her life, her ass, to face an ultra-conservative and moralistic society. The work I have been doing with her is not just about her story and series, here in many space. It is about opening a space harder to use before for her to tell her story, her life. Thank you, and sorry for my connection. sorry. Thank you.
No, thank you, Julián, for your presentation. Again, it's always very powerful to hear you speak. And I just again wanted to just highlight that work that you do and what you mentioned about like the communication always being horizontally, and that I think it's been a key for the success of your projects and your programs in the museum. So I thank you again